with all of that, I want to introduce our guest. I want to get into the topic. I guess maybe first things first, the topic. The topic is how product leaders can free up developer time to build what matters most. I know this is something that for product people, especially as we're working our developer teams with our developer partners, this is always top of mind, right? Like this is something that's important to all of us. I know it's important to those development partners as well. So I think we're gonna have a great conversation here. And to have that conversation, I have with me the head of product at Sendbird, Shailesh Nalawadi. And Shailesh, I'm really excited to have you with me here.
Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. I'm also happy to be here. And I should say, like this is an evergreen topic when it comes to PMs and engineers. So I'm excited to share kind of my perspective of this.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I appreciate it. Now, I asked everybody in the chat. I'll ask you, even though I've already asked you before we went live, but where are you tuning in from today, Shailesh?
Yes, I'm joining from Morgan Hill, California, which is where I live. Morgan Hill is just outside of San Jose, so really part of the greater Silicon Valley area.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, nice to be connected with you. I guess we'll start right in with some questions that I had. Which is, I know I've had varying experiences when it comes to working with development teams, the companies that I've been with in the past. All of them have been, lucky for me, positive experiences, but sometimes it does seem like it might take development teams longer than what I might have expected going in, whether it's producing a feature or a certain product. Is that a normal thing? Like, am I alone in that, or is that a normal thing? And why do you think that happens? Why does it sometimes seem that way?
Yeah. It's always a joke. When projects actually finish on time, on budget, and on spec, it's always a bit of a surprise, right? In fact, I almost remember there's that kind of a statement that people make, like you can have a project that's on budget, on time, and on spec, but you can only have 2 out of the 3. It's like a truism in product management and in engineering. But if you think about the reasons why that happens, why projects usually end up taking a lot longer, I think some of the reasons are quite obvious, right? It's that maybe the specifications weren't clear when we started off with. Either they were not clear because we didn't take the time to really articulate everything down to the level of detail required, or that unexpectedly new requirements came up, either because you dove into the problem and you understood it better, or that there was an under-anticipated area, or that the users or the customers had a change of heart, right? So specifications change in the middle. And then the other time sometimes is that there is an underestimation of the expertise required and the time required, and the two are really related, to execute on a project, right? It turns out maybe the engineering team may not have all the expertise. That maybe the research phase takes a lot longer because there's potentially some different technical choices. And the architecture needs to be thought through carefully before you jump in. So any number of reasons, and actually it's quite common that projects end up taking longer than anticipated. And I'd say from a PM perspective, that's kind of the main reason why product management is hard, is that you're reacting dynamically as you learn more information about the problem that you're trying to address. So I'd say, like, nothing to be really worried about. It happens actually all the time.
Well, that, and you know what, all those reasons you gave, they're perfectly legitimate reasons, right? Like, I don't think any of the things that you said weren't things that we should come down hard on the development team about.
No.
Those are all
No.
perfectly reasonable. I will ask you this, sometimes, well, I just know, again, thinking back, sometimes it's not even driven by me just saying, oh, I wish we were doing this faster, but maybe I'm getting that email from the CEO or whoever it might be, kind of putting the pressure on. And we do need to get together with the development team. How do you approach them? Whether it's that leader on the development team that we're working with, how do you approach that person to better understand how they're spending their time, how things are being focused on without being that person, that, it's sort of coming off as micromanaging. Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, actually, I'd say my first answer is it depends. It really depends, I think, on the person on the other side, your engineering colleague that you're working with. I found that, yeah, I'm particularly quite sensitive to not coming across as micromanaging. I want to respect the talent and the expertise of my partner. But I also want to be clear about what are really important requirements for me. So time is a feature in every kind of specification that you put out. And what I mean by that is, that this set of features that you have spec'd out and you want your engineering team to work on, one of the features of that is a timely delivery and a launch that happens within a certain time frame. So framing, like, asking the question about, hey, when do you think you can deliver this, is may come across as being nagging, but saying like, hey, this whole feature is only useful if it can be released and completed within the next 6 to 12 months, makes it, removes time from like a thing that you have to always check in on, but actually moves it into the requirement and gets discussed upfront. So I think it's very important to have the discussion about timelines upfront, and actually to also break down a large project into smaller milestones. And that way, the smaller milestones are an easy way to get an early indication if things are not moving at the same pace as you'd expect.
Yeah, that's great advice. And actually, that sort of answers a question that just came in from the audience. By the way, just a reminder, everybody, keep those questions coming in. I see this one coming in, so I wanted to go to it now. So yeah, keep them coming in. I love to get to more of your questions as well. But their question was, are there tips to mitigate making projects take longer than expected? And I think what you just brought up might be one way to do it, right? Like help start to break those down into smaller chunks from the beginning, might have a better perspective of that. Are there other pieces of advice you would give on that front too?
Yeah, I think just relentlessly polishing the set of required features. Every project is broken down into releases, and then there's always the very first release, the version 1.0, and that's usually the most critical one. And having in your mind the very minimal set of features required for something to be viable, I think it's commonly referred to as an MVP. I think that is a good technique to say, like, we can't go out unless we have these minimal things. And then continually challenging yourself, like, is this MVP really the MVP? Is it, is there something that we can do that's even smaller than this, that allows us to get out there, validate, and build the momentum? So I think the concept of MVP, especially for version 1.0 product releases, are, I think are good ones.
Yeah, I like that. I know that it used to be anyway that the one of the hot debates between product people and the engineering team was sort of that buy versus build decision. Should we actually be building this, or is this something that we might be able to get off the shelf somewhere else? I'm curious to get your take on that. Like, is that still the debate that's happening? Is there a different debate that's kind of top of mind now? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly, it's not as binary as just like, should we build or should we buy? I think there's a continuum of, between build everything in-house and then buy everything outright, of like, which aspects should we build, which ones should we, buy, how do we integrate, the 3 different things that we build together. So I think that, it is still the same question, but the answer is not a yes or no anymore. It's like, it's like a many shades of gray. And I think there are a whole different bunch of parameters that go into kind of deciding where you are at the spectrum. But I'd say at a high level, it is the same question, but the answers are not binary.
Got you. And so what, I guess, if that is the question, I know the answer might not be a clear yes, no, but how do you sort of figure that out? How do you make that determination when it might make sense? And maybe we might be able to get that project done quicker if we did, buy versus build, or maybe it's the other way around. How do you sort of think through that as a team?
No, I think honestly that's the central question. And as I was preparing for this conversation, and I was like, sitting down and thinking about all the things, the parameters that I consider, I actually took the liberty, if you don't mind, of kind of putting it together and having a couple of slides
Oh, nice.
And if you don't mind, I'm just going to quickly, share that
Sure.
and maybe walk you through this.
Yeah, no, that'd be
This
great.
kind of framework I have. So give me a minute while I work Zoom to do the screen sharing. And
Oh, perfect.
hopefully you guys can see this. Okay,
Yeah, we can.
great. All right. So here's what I had in mind, right? I actually, I started writing down all of these parameters that I have, and I'll walk through each of them. And then I kind of rearrange them, and I say, like, is there a clever acronym for this? And it turned out that I could say, S turbo. So this is by no means a comprehensive list of it, but these are kind of the things that I rely on as a rubric every time I'm considering a decision. So let me walk you through what this is, right? Several different considerations when you're thinking about build versus buy. One, strategic, which is that, is this a feature that is the main reason why customers buy from you? Or is this something that you can charge extra for? Or is this a feature that is going to give you a competitive advantage? Now, the reason I mention this is because there are some features which are like, hey, this makes us different from everyone else. And there are some features which are like, all customers expect us to have this, but it's not a reason why they would choose us over someone else. So as a rule, you want to apply your most precious resources, which is your engineering team, to the features that will help you stand out from the competition, right? And so that's kind of where you want your engineering leaders and your designers kind of really thinking. And then everything else, which I call undifferentiated heavy lifting, that should be candidates for buying or potentially integrating from a third-party vendor. So that's kind of one. Second, I'd say is timeline. This is obvious, but building it in-house usually ends up taking more time. And sometimes you're in a crunch mode, or there's a deadline that you need to get something out by. So what is the timeline that you have? Third is user experience. Kind of similar to my first point, is the standard user experience sufficient for this feature? By standard, I mean the experience of the competition, or is it important for competitive reasons to create a differentiated experience? For example, every service has every product out there has a help center, and in the help center there's an FAQ. Now, do you want the help center, the FAQ, to be a differentiated experience, or are you thinking like, what, an FAQ should be kind of the same as every FAQ? It's very functional. It should answer it, and it should be completely standard in terms of user experience. So that's an example where I don't really want to create innovation in kind of help center and FAQ. I just want my users to be familiar with it and get it done. So I'm going to stick to the standard model. The other one that's interesting and is actually the regulations and the regulatory environment. Prior to Sendbird, I worked in product management at Google in a variety of consumer-facing products, and I was often surprised by the design constraints that were imposed by privacy and data protection and other regulatory issues, right? These regulatory compliance issues would often lead to significant increases in the complexity of the product design, and you wouldn't know this upfront. And as you kind of get into the design, you're like, oh my God, like, there's this one other law and we have to do these other things. And so if you think that there's going to be a kind of a regulatory dimension to the product features that you're working on, it helps to have a partner that has done this before, probably has done the research, and has anticipated kind of the regulatory compliance related features. The last two I would mention is budget. And in particular, there is this idea of CapEx versus OpEx, which is that do you have the ability to spend upfront, or are there constraints where you only want to spend as the service gains more usage? So if you're going to build it in-house, you have to staff up an engineering team, you have to make the investment upfront, and then down the road you kind of reap the benefits in terms of revenue and so on. But maybe in your case, that is a constraint and you can't afford to invest upfront. In that case, buying from a SaaS vendor and then paying on a per usage basis is easier, from a financial perspective, right? And you can match your revenues with your costs. And I think the last one I would mention, just to kind of round things out, is organization. right? Do you have the in-house talent and expertise required to update and maintain this feature? These days there's so many different skill sets, there are different technical stacks, UX paradigms, mobile versus Android, Flutter versus iOS and Android. There are all these new frameworks are always coming up, and sometimes the building a service requires a skill that your current team may not have. So I think it's okay to kind of sit down and have that conversation with your engineering counterpart, and say like, do we have the expertise to do this? Do we want to develop the expertise to do this? And if the answer is no, I think that is a good indication that we should look to partner with someone. So these are some of the parameters that I have had to consider in when I've been confronted with build versus buy. And as I said at the outset, it's by no means kind of exhaustive. So I'm going to pause here because I also have a couple of examples that maybe would help illustrate this, but let me know if you'd like me to walk through.
No, this is great. I would say, I'd love to. Of course, I have a lot of questions for you, but let's go through those examples because that might either answer some of the questions I had or it might prompt some new ones. So yeah, I'd love to hear some of those examples.
Sure. So I took the liberty of, having explained this thing out, I thought it might be good to kind of use them in the context of a couple of examples. The first example is, self-service billing that Sendbird has implemented. As many of you, some of you that have used Sendbird will know, like we have this whole self-service mechanism. We can come in, sign up for the service, slap down a form of payment, and actually start using it without having to talk to any person in our team. Now, Sendbird self-service relies on a subscription API service for customer billing. Now, there are very high processing fees, but billing was honestly a part of the user experience. So we needed to do something quickly. And so as I contemplated kind of, what we should do for our subscription API, I asked myself, like, is this a feature strategically, is this a feature that will differentiate us from our competition? It turned out that there are many in-app chat vendors and all of them have some version of come in and self-serve yourself. So it didn't feel like something that was really strategic. In terms of timeline, do we have the time we need to build and test this feature out? As in always, it's like, oh my God, we need this and we need this now. So we were under a time crunch to really get this thing done. User experience, do we need to customize the user experience for our use case? Well, having the ability to collect your credit card information, for example, is fairly standard. And so honestly, the user experience, didn't need to be very radically different. So we were comfortable with a very standard kind of templated user experience. Regulatory and compliance, there's a ton of issues around collecting money, storing the form of payment in your database. What happens if that database gets leaked out and unexpected charges get assigned? So there's a not insignificant amount of regulation around storing payment information. So we wanted to be careful about how much we built this thing ourselves. Budget, do we have access to a large upfront capital? Now here I would say that if we really thought it was important, we were willing to allocate the engineering to kind of build this thing out. But and so I scored this thing a little bit higher. And then lastly, do we have the in-house talent and expertise required to update and maintain this feature? We are focused on in-app chat. We spend a lot of our effort on scaling and building all those things. Maintaining payments was not an area that was interesting to us. Neither was it something that we really cared to build out. So I scored this as 0. So looking at this thing in entirety, it was fairly obvious to me that we should honestly just go out and do research and bring in a bunch of vendors who will help you do subscription management and use that in our service versus building it ourselves. And now let me use another example. This time though, it's not from my perspective, but it's actually from the perspective of my customers. So we had a dating app called Hinge. It's pretty popular. And they had considered adding video chat for their users, but never really prioritized it earlier on. Now, when the pandemic hit, just like everyone, video quickly became a must-have feature where in the past it might have been a nice to have. And Hinge discovered that many of its users were turning to Zoom actually for virtual dates. So they were under a time crunch. They're like, hey, we need to bring this experience in-house for a variety of reasons. And we need to add video calls and phone calls in-app as part of our features to keep our users connected. Now, in their case, they probably went through the same kind of analysis. Strategic, is this something that is important for us? Absolutely, right? The market has changed. We need to add this feature. Timeline, do we have the time to properly build this thing? No, we're in the midst of a pandemic. There is a once in a generation change in user behavior. We need to move quickly to take advantage of it. User experience, do we need to customize the user experience for our use case? I'd say yes. They wanted to make sure that it was incorporated into their branded experience and not like we are to then dial a phone number and go out and have that. Regulation and compliance, less of an issue here. That there was a lot of regulatory issues. Budget was not an issue. I mean, this was an existential issue for Hinge. So they could have, if they really thought it was important, they could have thrown a lot of resources at it. But most importantly, organization, did they have the talent in-house to build a branded in-app video and audio calls experience? They didn't. So in this case, when they kind of went through this parameter, they, I think, very quickly came to the conclusion that let's find a partner who can help us build a in-app video and calls experience. And that's kind of how they went with us in terms of doing this. And a last example, if you will, for me to kind of illustrate the point, is DoorDash, who are another customer of Sendbird. They had a similar issue, which is that they realized that poor communication between a consumer and a dasher was a common cause for food delivery issues. The engineering team there decided that it would be important to make it easy for consumers to chat directly and coordinate directly with the dasher around an order that was being placed inside of the application. Now, prior to in-app chat, both parties could communicate only via text and phone numbers. And these two options were not always the most reliable. In fact, often when the dasher would try to contact the customer, they would make a phone call and the phone call would be from an unfamiliar number, which then the consumer would just ignore, right? Now, because in-app chat doesn't rely on phone numbers and users don't have to leave the app when they want to chat, the product and engineering team were able to kind of decrease their never delivered rate for orders and prove that in-app chat was successful, right? And now, if you think about this framework, a whole lot of very similar things were going on. Strategic, is this important? Is this feature important? It turns out, that having the ability to do communicate between dashers and consumers was important, but it wasn't necessarily the most strategic thing that they had to do. They just needed to make sure that it worked. The timeline was less of an issue, but they were seeing not delivered rates, and they wanted to address it. User experience, yes, they absolutely wanted to have this happen inside of the application. The regulatory issues, not so much in this case. Budget, I think DoorDash, for them, this was a huge problem. And so they were willing to spend. And if it required an in-house team, they would have done it. But ultimately, they chose to go with Sendbird because they're like, this is a solved problem. We should just be able to use it. And we want our engineering team focused on more critical things like within the user experience of the app. So that's, kind of insight into DoorDash's decision to go with Sendbird for their in-app chat between dashers and consumers. So, three examples where just asking the questions around these, 6 key areas really helps frame the decision of build versus buy and kind of the nuances of it.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the examples for sure. And by the way, I didn't even mention this to you beforehand, Shailesh, but seeing Hinge there, if people wanted to ask more about the Hinge's experience, actually the CPO of Hinge, Michelle Parsons, is going to be speaking at Industry next fall. So we haven't even announced that yet. So nice little tie in there. But that's awesome. Wonderful. I appreciate you sharing these. Let's see. We'll go back to the two of us now. Let's see. So I want to go back to asking, again, talking about that buy build decision and seeing this framework's helpful. Actually, I know I'll probably get people asking me if they can have that slide. So maybe I could put that in your mind. I could share that with folks afterwards, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So when we're having that decision with engineering, or I guess how does that decision play out? Is it a conversation we're having with engineering, getting their input? I imagine that's at the very least, we should be doing that. Is it a team decision then at that point? How does that usually play out?
Yeah, look, engineers, I think, tend to be of an analytical bent. And I think having a framework for the decision is always helpful. So it doesn't feel like, hey, I kind of feel like we should do this, in this particular way. But actually breaking it down, I think helps clarify to our partners that there's a method here. So especially when dealing with engineering, I think it is always a good idea to say, here are all the things that I'm considering as I approach this decision. And then, work with them and say like, hey, here's what I think in terms of, our ability to, to create a differentiated user experience. Do you agree? So it becomes kind of a framework to make a joint decision, which I think is always a good way, where they feel like they're bought into it, they've had input in the decision, and they agree with kind of the outcome of what the framework says.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. That's great. There's a couple more audience questions coming in. And by the way, keep those coming in. I want to get to as many of your questions as I can here. Somebody asked the question if, so can you offer any insight into the buy wall that businesses run into when customizing is required? And that can be the case sometimes where it's like, hey, we have very specific needs. How does that sort of weigh into all of this?
Yeah, I think, look, first of all, when someone says, I'm interested in your service, but I need some customization, you should anticipate that, right? Everyone, believes that they need something bespoke. And some of it, I think, is potentially walking them through various examples. So first of all, if they have questions in the sales process, when I'm assuming like if someone's considering should they buy or not, and they have questions, creating a wealth of content, so that they can review these things is important. Second, case studies will help, someone evaluating your product realize that, oh, actually, of these 6 or 7 case studies, 2 of them actually resonate really strongly with me because it really speaks to the challenges that I'm facing. So I identify with that, and I have some, social proof and confidence that, I too can end up purchasing it. And then lastly, I'd say, always give customers the option of like talking to someone live. I think everyone these days has the talk to us right now button. And there's a reason for that, right? Because they realize that it almost never is the case that someone says, oh, I'm just going to read a bunch of docs and then hit the buy button. They always want to have someone to reach out to. So I would say definitely, provide all of those options for someone that is interested in evaluating it.
I like that. No, it's a great piece of feedback for sure. Another audience question I'll go to here because it's relevant, right? Coming off of those examples you shared, they appreciated the examples. They liked the examples. Their question was, they imagine that many times, well, I think they pointed out 2 of those 3 examples, the rating was like a 3 out of 6. So sort of right in the middle. And many times it might fall in the middle. Is there a single or specific criteria to sort of hone in and helping drive that final decision? Like, is any one of those maybe more important than the others as a tiebreaker, so to speak? Or how would you answer that question?
Yeah, so I'll give you my kind of personal answer. And for me, the timeline is probably the most critical one, right? Everything boils down to our ability to get this project completed on time and in the hands of customers. And so usually if I feel like the one option gives us a substantial advantage in terms of getting to market first, then I would lean towards timeline as being using that as the one that maybe is over indexed and overweighted in terms of in terms of the analysis.
That's great. Yeah, and oftentimes that's like timeline. That's what we're being pressed on, at the very top level, and so that makes sense to me for sure. Kind of moving on from audience questions, I have a couple more questions of my own, which is, we've talked about this buy versus build. Sometimes, I mean, in a way, APIs, that's a buy, decision, kind of tapping into APIs. Have you seen, I guess, like, what kind of benefits do you see when it comes to leveraging APIs? Curious, just your personal experiences. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think, first of all, APIs, I think, encode, some of the best practices of people that have been thinking about a domain a lot longer than I have, right? Referring back to the example of subscription billing. Now, anyone that is a product manager and has had experience with subscriptions can tell you, yeah, I mean, I kind of understand how to build it, right? From the surface, it seems fairly easy to understand. But the amount of complexity and the reason why these standalone companies exist is because there's so much complexity, regulations under the hood that are not apparent until you really dig into it. And so when I purchase an API, I am purchasing not just the specific transactional capabilities, but I'm also purchasing the knowledge of the people that designed it, the thought that went into it, the experience they've had over the quarters and the years building this API, correcting the bugs, changing it based on consumer perceptions, changes in environment, regulations, and so on. So I'm really buying an entire service, even though it's being delivered as an API. So I very much evaluate a customer, a vendor's experience, the white papers, how thoughtful are they? Do they highlight things that I had not considered, when I superficially thought I could build this myself. So I would look at all of those things, and if you feel confident that working with this partner gives you, allows you to kind of ride on their shoulders of the work that they've done, and then I think you have strong confidence that you're making the right choice.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful for sure. Is there, I think one of the other things, or at least a consideration that I'm sure people try to make, is that their product is the way that it is today, but things move fast in the world of tech, right? Like what the product might look like in the future, it might be completely different. So how do you sort of, how do you factor that in when you're thinking buy versus build, of what that product is today versus how you want it to evolve? Like how do you sort of factor that in?
Actually, let me see if I can answer this in a slightly different way, or maybe that's your intention.
Yeah.
I want to highlight the concept of sunk cost fallacy, right? Which is that if you have slaved over something and really worked hard to build it, you have this very strong affinity for it. And potentially, even if it's not working and you need to scrap it and try a different approach, you're like, look, I know how much time I put into it. I know the in and out of every design decision that I made to pull this thing up. And so you're kind of wedded to that implementation. But as you said, our industry is very dynamic, and you have to be willing to kind of, break everything apart and rebuild it. And I'd say one of the hidden advantages of using APIs is that, mentally speaking, you're not bought into it so much because, you haven't, really invested a lot of your time. And so maybe you can be a little bit more objective about like, hey, it's time to change. Okay, like maybe it's time to swap out this vendor and go with another vendor because they have different capabilities, or that our product is moving in a different direction, and the ability to move is relatively easy because we are built on top of someone else's APIs.
Yeah, no, that does help for sure. I appreciate that. Let's see. What about, so sometimes we have our internal engineering teams. Sometimes we're working with outsourced engineering teams that might supplement that internal team, or maybe we're really relying on them for the brunt of the work. How does that factor in? Yeah, I'm curious if it factors in at all. Like, does it change things or not? What's your take on that, Shailesh?
I think it adds another shade of nuance to the decision. I think at the outset, in my kind of framework, I said, strategic. Is this important for us? And organizationally, I also said, is it important for us to have this institutional knowledge within our company, within our engineering team, right? And I think when you have an in-house engineering team versus an outsourced engineering team, I think some of the same decisions happen. How strategic is this? Is this something that we want within our company? Like we want our engineers and our solution architects to have this knowledge, or are we okay with having it be outside of the company and potentially be swapped out? And there may be things where you are maybe less concerned about it, and there may be core aspects of your technology where you're like, look, this part needs to be built within the company. So I think that is another additional nuance on some of the same parameters, and I think you should definitely take into account that. And by the way, implicit in my response was not just that should we go entirely with in-house versus entirely with outsourced. That again, that there is a shade, a blend there. Like some of it is done in-house, and some of it is done outsourced, and then some of it is purchased from a vendor using an API.
Yeah, it seems like that's the most common example of like, there's we're doing all of those things. The answer is yes to everything. So that, it sometimes can get a little trickier, I suppose. Well, I know we're getting closer to the end of our session. If there are any final questions from anybody else, let me know. But I guess one thing that's on my mind, Shailesh, and this might be a good closing question, actually. And I ask this to in almost every single one of these sessions at the very end, because, this is we put a lot of time into this session. We've talked about a lot of things, a lot of great insights here, but sometimes it's that one or two insights that really stick with us once we leave a session. And oftentimes, just by design, they come at the end, because it's like what goes in our brain last. So if people did walk away from this session with one or two big takeaways, what would you want those takeaways to be?
Actually, maybe this actually, just came to me as I was listening to you talk about it, is, we often talk about build versus buy. Maybe if I can offer a slightly different perspective, because choice of words sometimes makes a difference. I would say our role as product and engineering leaders is assembling the solution rather than building it or buying it. Really what we're doing is, it's like, the Lego pieces that we used to have, that I certainly had growing up, is you're taking blocks of different sizes. Some are the small pieces with different colors, some of the big square blocks of the white color. And then you're really putting this thing together to build, to create the solution, right? So if you use the word assemble, then I think you give yourself permission and the flexibility to say some pieces of this are going to be things that I build. And some pieces of this, I'm just going to take a prefab piece from somewhere else and then just bolt it into it, right? And so, just to, if you will permit me to extend that analogy a little bit further, Ford and General Motors don't really build cars. They're often actually assembling cars with components built from other vendors. And so that is also the way that we should think about software engineering and building software products, is that we are assembling experiences. And, depending on the perspective, depending on the vendors, it's an ever-changing answer to how we assemble these things together.
I love that. Yeah, I never really thought of that, right? We think like Ford makes cars, and they do, but it's with all these pieces and parts that are made by others as well. And you're right. It's that assembly that happens. So I like that. I think that's a great place to end. So yeah, Shailesh, I really appreciate you taking the time for all of this. I appreciate everybody for taking the time for joining. If people wanted to keep the learning going, again, I'm going to share this recording with everybody, and it sounds like I could get that slide from you. Do you have, I know Sendbird also has all sorts of other resources. Is there anything else you'd recommend to folks?
Yeah, as in all things, we have, our website where we've taken the time to really kind of put together a whole bunch of resources for folks that are, contemplating how do you, add an in-app chat, experience, how do you foster user engagement? That's the thing that we focus a lot on. And so we have a great amount of resources on our website, sendbird.com, which we're happy to share as well. And maybe you can see some of our, what I described today in terms of the framework, kind of implemented in how we approach our customers' build versus buy decision kind of played out. So it'd be a good kind of academic exercise as well.
That's awesome. Well, I'll be sure to include that in the email as well. So yeah, again, Shailesh, thank you so much. And everybody attending, thank you very much. We have more industry webinars and interviews coming up. So I'll let you know about those as well. But with all of that, I hope everybody has a great rest of the afternoon, and I will see everybody soon. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.